On March 1st of 2026, thousands of people filled Cornerstone Church in San Antonio, Texas, and settled into silence as John Hagee stepped to the pulpit to deliver a sermon he titled, God's Coming Operation Epic Fury Against Iran. The sermon, named Iran directly, described a coming judgment as sudden and absolute, and placed it inside a prophetic sequence Hagee had been teaching for the better part of his 50-year ministry. What nobody in that congregation could have known was that within weeks, American and Israeli forces would strike Iranian soil, and the recording of that March sermon would begin circulating across the internet in a way that stopped people mid-scroll. Millions of people who follow Hagee have spent decades watching him read the Bible and the Middle East as a single unfolding story, and right now, those same people are pulling up the news with Scripture open beside it. Whether that parallel carries prophetic weight or has another explanation entirely is a question worth taking seriously, and we're going to walk through all of it. John Hagee is 86 years old, and across more than 5 decades he has built one of the most consequential evangelical ministries in American Christianity. He founded Christians United for Israel, authored books that reached millions of readers, and delivered sermons before senators, presidents, and prime ministers in rooms most religious leaders never enter. None of that long history is what has people paying close attention to him right now. What pulled everyone's focus was the substance of what Hagee said in that San Antonio church, and the timing of when he said it, weeks before a military operation that matched the nation he had named from the pulpit. This isn't just a story about John Hagee. It's a story about what happens when a life built entirely on faith and Scripture collides with a world that, to millions of believers, is beginning to look like the closing chapter of the book of Revelation. That question about whether prophetic times have arrived isn't confined to theology classrooms or church basements right now. It's sitting in living rooms and pews across the country, and it isn't going away. What most people don't realize about Hagee's approach is that he has never been reverse engineering his interpretations to fit the news cycle, and the theological framework behind his preaching has been in place for decades. That framework is called Dispensationalism, a prophetic system within Christian eschatology that maps specific end times events onto specific nations in a specific sequence. And the nations it identifies include Russia, Turkey, Iran, and Israel. Hagee has preached for years that those 3 nations will invade Israel and that the invading forces will be destroyed, not by opposing armies, but through earthquakes, hail, and what he describes as friendly fire, language drawn directly from the Old Testament book of Ezekiel. And that's when the chronology becomes genuinely difficult to set aside, because the nations Hagee named in that prophetic sequence are the exact nations that have dominated international news coverage throughout this period. If you're finding this as surprising as we did, you'll want to stay with this channel, because we cover stories like this every week that most people never encounter. Hagee's followers aren't treating that overlap as coincidence, and the harder you look at the timeline, the easier it is to understand why they aren't. Looking more carefully at what Hagee actually said in that March sermon makes the timing harder to dismiss. The sermon bore the title, God's Coming Operation Epic Fury Against Iran, and in it, Hagee named Iran directly, described the coming judgment as divine and overwhelming, and anchored it inside the same end times sequence he has been preaching from for the length of his ministry. Weeks after that sermon, military strikes on Iranian soil began, and congregants who had been sitting in that church started sharing the recording far beyond their own circles. Reasonable observers will point out that Hagee maintains long-standing relationships, trusted advisors, and decades of closely watching the Middle East, and that informed religious leaders often read geopolitical signals earlier than the general public does. But here's the thing. To the millions of people who have followed John Hagee through 50 years of televangelist ministry, the gap between that sermon and those strikes carried a weight that geopolitical awareness alone didn't seem to cover. A second thread runs alongside that story, and it deserves attention. Hagee and his son Matt have been issuing warnings about what they describe as an explosion of Jew hatred spreading across the world today, connecting it to both spiritual and historical roots that stretch back centuries. None of that is happening in isolation, and what Hagee's ministry announced for August 31st of this year is the detail that reveals exactly how much confidence they carry about the future of Israel. But that part of the story deserves its own moment. Most people come to this story through the prophecy angle, but the deeper thread running through it has less to do with prediction and more to do with purpose. At its center, this is the story of an 86-year-old man who has devoted his entire adult life to preparing ordinary people, the kind of people sitting in church pews on Sunday mornings in San Antonio and cities across the country, for something he genuinely believes is coming, and who has done that work across decades of being dismissed, challenged, and labeled extreme by critics inside and outside the Christian faith. That's not what ambition looks like, because ambition tends to soften when the cost gets high enough. Hagee kept preaching through every wave of criticism without adjusting his message to make it more comfortable, and real conviction of that kind, the kind that holds its position when holding it is unpopular, has become genuinely uncommon in American religious life. That's the part of this story worth sitting with, regardless of where you personally land on dispensationalism or end times theology. Drop a comment below and let us know. Have you ever held a belief about faith, family, or the future so firmly that you stayed with it even when the people around you thought you were off base? There's no wrong answer, and we'd genuinely like to hear from you. Now, back to that August 31st announcement, because this is where the story stops being abstract. Hagee Ministries has a full pilgrimage to Israel booked for this summer, August 31st, 2026, and that booking exists squarely in the middle of rising regional conflict, active headlines about strikes on Iranian soil, and a level of tension that most travel advisors would identify as a serious concern. John Hagee is not retreating, not canceling, and not hedging the itinerary. He is sending his people to Jerusalem and to the land of Israel with complete confidence that they belong there. That decision communicates something that no sermon alone could, because you don't commit to a religious pilgrimage in a contested region unless the belief behind it runs deeper than words on a page. Hagee has stated his position directly. Israel is the only nation created by a sovereign act of God. 50 years of ministry have not moved him from that conviction, and the flights scheduled for August confirm that he holds it now with the same force he always has. If you've been following Hagee's ministry and have watched his end times theology unfold across the years, drop a comment below and let us know. We'd genuinely like to know how long you've been paying attention to this story. History carries a consistent pattern. The people later generations call visionaries were, in their own time, almost always the ones being told they had gone too far. John Hagee has carried that tension across 86 years of ministry, and as of this spring, he is still standing at the pulpit in San Antonio, still teaching the same prophetic sequence he mapped out decades ago. The next story we're covering involves another figure from American religious history, someone whose final years held a secret that completely reframes what most people thought they understood about his life's work. And if you've spent any time studying faith in this country, the name will be familiar the moment we say it. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it. It costs nothing, and it's the only way to make sure we can keep telling stories like this one.